don't give it the environment to grow in. The thing with molds is that they are very robust. They grow where bacteria can't. And so when you might not have bacterial contamination, but yeah, molds, as you know from just looking at your fridge, yeah, molds will grow anywhere and things like that.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Feed Science Podcast, brought to you by Wisenetics. Today we're going to talk a bit about mold and mycotoxins with Dr. Keith Warriner. Doctor, I'll ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about what you do.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Bob. Yeah, so I'm based at the University of Guelph, which is in Canada, which is near Toronto. And I'm a food microbiologist by trade. So essentially our sort of concern is to do with bacterial pathogens, especially on fresh produce and meat. But you can't ignore mycotoxins because obviously they're getting more prevalent because of the climate change and the ability to detect them. So we've done some diagnostic work with patulin and deoxynivalenol. And so it's one of those concerns that do affect the industry. But yeah, here we generally do food microbiology and I teach food microbiology, industrial microbiology, and food safety management. So
Okay, well, if you don't mind, let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about how mycotoxins and those types of things were discovered?
and it's a very interesting story that, and I always interested to see its imposition with antibiotics. So obviously, mycotoxins were discovered relatively recently to us oldies, because it was in the 1950s and 60s, a generation to the younger generation. But obviously, way before then, we've always had this sort of association with it. And you go through history, for example, and you could imagine, obviously back then life expectancy was about 34 or something like that. And you wonder how many cases were due to this sort of myco-intoxication. And we get these big stories about St. Anthony's fire, for example. And St. Anthony's fire, it was this sort of sickness posed against this village, and the people say we're burning up and things like that. Hence Anthony's fire, who was the monk then. And I thought it was botulism, but then more recently the science saying, well, it could be ergots con clavipus, and these ergots obviously were involved in the sort of Salem witches where everyone was getting delirious and things like that. I'd say, oh yes, because of contaminated rye with claviceps. Anyway, so to the point. So we've known about these, but really I think the discovery of mycotoxins occurred more in the early 1900s. So we know the story about Alexander Fleming. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, and this penicillin was an antibiotic and saved lives and everything like that. Obviously, people had noticed this sort of antimicrobial action of these products produced by moles, and they didn't isolate it, but Alexander Fleming did that. And that brought him a wealth of fortune. Obviously, this big market of antibiotics, which we say, oh, is it good or bad? But to the point, I am getting to the point about what are mycotoxins. So it was interesting. It was an interesting story about patulin. So, Alexander Fleming in the 1928 discovered penicillin, and it took a bit of time to purify. And about the same, obviously, the scientists of the day were looking at Alexander Fleming, saying, "Look at this one. Look how much prestige he's got and money and things like that." And there was someone called Dr. Guy who used to work at in London Hospital, and he had this flu symptoms. And what happened is that he saw this culture of penicillin, and he says, I'm going to drink that to see if it cures me, because obviously the cure for common cold would be, oh, it's even better than Fleming. Anyway, to the point. So he basically he drank this sort of media from this mold, which was brave enough, and his condition improved. And he took that as accounting for the fact that, oh, I've discovered something that cures a common cold. So he kind of went to the war room, but it was about 1941, and said, look, I've got a cure for the common cold. It's going to really aid the war effort. And so we went to the new medical council, which was been established then. Medical council is overseeing the sort of medical, all these treatments and that. And it's actually the first sort of trial that they performed. And the reason why it was special is that they had a placebo, a non-active drug, and they got this sort of magic compound that Guy had discovered, and they started to feed it to people. And what was happening is that it was making people sick, but obviously this guy didn't want to lose faith. So the point was is that he just kind of, should we say, fabricated the results. And when they saw this sort of in the medical council saying, "Oh, look, it's a wonder drug," they big scale, and they went thousands of people, and the observers of the time said people going well and come out sick. And this is to your point. Because it was in the wartime, it was obviously under the Secrets Act, and it was 40 years until they actually released the real information. And essentially, what they discovered was patulin and mycotoxin, which makes people sick. And so, basically, what this is the imposition is that we think about antibiotics as saying the wonder drugs. But in actual fact, mycotoxins are like antibiotics; they're antimicrobial. But the trouble is, they're sort of anti-animal and anti-people as well to make us sick. So the big events in the 1950s, so we're starting to see, these sort of what we call secondary metabolites from molds aren't all antibiotics. They've become very toxic. And then, as you probably know in history about Agent X with the 100,000 turkeys over in the UK, suddenly died. That's when mycotoxins were said, yes, it's mycotoxin. And that's what we've had ever since. And with mycotoxins, there's around about 500. I think there's definitely more than 500 which are known. And they have been devastating. And the reason why they're devastating is, as you know, it really impacts not only on animal health, animal reproduction, but our health as well. So, to answer your original question, mycotoxins were basically discovered in 1960s. But like I say, this sort of imposition with antibiotics is an interesting one because everyone's kind of striving to get the next antibiotic, when in reality they could be producing the next mycotoxin. Anyway, such is life.
Correct. Okay. Well, hey, I found that very interesting, and if those of you viewing do as well, maybe you'd like to hit that like button and help us out a bit. I guess tied onto that question, then, how many molds and how many mycotoxins and toxins are we aware of today? Uh, it seems like not a real big data set if we're just talking about since 1960. How many of them are there, do you think?
And that's a very interesting question because I still believe it's this sort of what's an antibiotic and what's a mycotoxin. And as you're probably aware, in clinical fields, the what we call the fourth generation of antibiotics have really serious side effects. And you think, well, is that the mycotoxin? Is that the border where it starts really negatively affecting people? So some people say 1,000, some people say 500. But I think the definition of a mycotoxin is so blurred, is that, what's one and what's the other? But certainly, when you look at evolution, if you look at molds even, there's so many different types of mold, many different strains, and not all molds produce mycotoxin. The reality is they've got these specialized enzyme systems called polyketides or non-ribosomal peptide synthesis, which are really huge. It's like carrying a piano on your back if you're a mold, because the most complex enzymes ever found in microbes. And basically, it's how they distribute these between them. And so, to answer your question, how many are there? I think there's definitely 4 that we're really concerned about. But certainly, I think it's, like I say, over 500, maybe over 1,000, maybe even more than that. But not thankfully, I suppose, is that we can simplify things. We know what the main ones are. We know what the main molds are. Aspergillus, penicillium, fusarium. We know we've got a list of mycotoxins, which goes on whatever. But we think, fumazine, aflatoxin, patchoulin, zenolium, deoxynavarol, T1, T2. So, to make it simple and manageable, I suppose those sort of key ones should be the target ones, because if you try to get all of them, you'll be a long time looking.
Well, and you mentioned aflatoxin, which those of us in the feed industry have heard of a lot, of course, in corns and that type of thing. How do these molds? So these molds just aren't they're not around all the time. There seems to be certain conditions and that type of thing that brings on certain molds or certain toxins, while at other times we don't see them in corn. Can you tell me a little bit about what makes a mold like that grow? What kind of conditions and things we need to be aware of?
Oh, for sure. So, like I mentioned, not all moles have these. Even with the same strain, they might not like this baggage of this polyketide and will sort of throw it out and live. So, if you like, a bit like us, plants are exposed to different microbes all the time, and they've evolved systems to prevent protection. We've got our immune system. Plants have got a kind of immune system, as you know. But really, what the key part is two things. There's three things actually. One is the cultivar. So, when we look at plants or grain, for example, highest yield, highest growing, but typically this can be expensive, its protection. And the other part about it is the stress the plant goes under. So when we're under stress, we're much more likely to acquire a cold or acquire infection. When we go on holidays, we're all excited and all that, all stressed out by the plane, and we get an infection once we get there. So it's how the plant survives, and connected to that is the climate. So up here in Canada, for example, we've got two weathers: -20 or +40 with humidity. And
Mm.
it's the humidity and the temperature that really gets them growing. So, and insect damage. So, what we've got is this sort of perfect storm where we've got a weakened plant, so we've got a susceptible plant, we've got a mold that's present. Then, once it gets onto the head, it's obviously starting to grow. And when it stops growing, that's the time it switches on its mycotoxin production. And the reason for it is it doesn't want to hurt us. It doesn't care about us. These are mycotoxins are there to kill the competitors because they know the plant's on a feeding zone, so it's going to get lots of other things coming in. So to answer your question again, because I do tend to go on, it's usually the variety, the stress, very long drought systems, very humid, warm temperature in the field. But then you get obviously post harvest. If you've damaged the grain, an entry point, it's lost protection. If you store it in wet, humid conditions again, that's all the mold needs to do to grow and then produce these mycotoxins. And so, because of climate change, those people who I know people go against climate change, but the reality is that when we've got this sort of imposition of genetic modification of plants to grow better, not defend themselves better, and the reality is we've got these warm, humid conditions we've had all the time, I guess, in a way. We're going to get more susceptible to mold. And on top of that layer, we've got better diagnostics now. So, back in not so long ago, to actually measure deoxynavarol, DON, used to be a big challenge, but now, just get a strip test and you've done it. So I think it's all these kind of things, but definitely, humid conditions and lack of good post-harvest handling are the two key things.
And so a guy like me, I'm a feed guy, right? So if I'm pelleting a corn product, for example, and of course I add a lot of steam to that, and then I cool it and put it away. If I improperly handle that pellet, let's say I leave some moisture in there, I put it out in the bin on a 90-degree day, can I grow those molds and those toxins in my feed bin? Between my processing point and my animal.
Absolutely. Even before that, because I guess people believe that, well, if you extrude a product, it's such high temperature that it'll destroy any toxin there. The reality is, things like Don, things like Zen, they're very tolerant to heating. So you could have your problems, but you are exactly right in that, when you've got a product you've extruded and you're kind of been in a rush and haven't dried it out, that's a key thing. And there was an interesting case study actually thinking about it just a few years ago, where was this sort of feed that had really gone mouldy, and they fed it to the animals, and the poor animals had succumbed. And that was exactly what you just said, is that they extruded it, and it was a rush order, so they didn't quite dry it out right. They delivered it to the farm, and even the farmer said, "This looks a bit wet and moist and warm." But you know what it's like, saying, "Well, it's here now, it's a rush, so we need it." And they put it in a silo. And a few weeks later, they opened the silo, it was full of mold, and they wondered why the animals had succumbed. So the key thing about mycotoxin or mold controls, well, mold and mycotoxin protection, is don't give it the environment to grow in. The thing with molds is that they are very robust. They grow where bacteria can't. And so when you might not have bacterial contamination, but yeah, molds, as you know from just looking at your fridge, yeah, molds will grow anywhere and things like that. So dryness for definite, and sanitation also very good, but don't let sanitation be at the cost of adding moisture, because that's where things go wrong.
Interesting. And if the people viewing find that interesting, you could subscribe here, and perhaps you'll see something else coming from us that is interesting as well. So, doctor, now the FSMA in the feed world has made those of us that are feeding swine and cattle and things more aware of these toxins, and we're now being asked to monitor for them and to test for them and those kind of things. And that's kind of straightforward. But can we talk a bit about what? Okay, oh well, now I found I've got a million bushel of corn in my bins that contain a toxin. Uh, how do I safely use that product?
And that's a good question as well, because it's like everything else. If you look for something, you're going to find it. And, I've looked at some statistics, and you've got to be careful of statistics, because they could say that, well, over the 50% of grain and cereals and nuts have mycotoxin in. Yeah, it depends where you sample from. But here in Canada, for example, in a recent sort of prevalence or survey, they did indeed, found 50% of grain, for example, harbors mycotoxins, things like Don, things like Fusarium. But only 12 to 18, it's a lot, 12 to 18% has it above regulatory levels. And the thing is as you probably guess, is regulatory levels get lower and lower and lower. And so it's harder and harder and harder to actually conform with them. So I think with mycotoxins, especially aflatoxin, Don, which is significant, you have to accept that it's a hazard likely to be encountered. And so what can you do, as you rightly said? Now, in the laboratory, there's been lots of different treatments assessed. I know in previously, a farmer told me what he does, or what he did, is dilute it down, so kind of blend it with good feed. But I think the concern there is saying, well, you're still putting it in. The idea is to discard it, but discarding feed at this economic climate isn't the best solution. So, as I mentioned to you, there's different methods people use. I think the most popular one, and when I say the most popular, I'm not a farmer, I'm not a female, so it's just what I hear, is that binders, for example. So, binders, as you probably know, are things like activated charcoal, silicates, and what happens here is that you mix them in with the feed. And what it does is kind of sequester these mycotoxins, bind them, because if you like, what mycotoxins are, they're fairly, well, relatively small, depending on what you're measuring, is that this is what they depend on. Mycotoxins depend on this sort of lock and key theory, which will disrupt the immune system, which will get into cause abortion or poor development. So you just need to either bind this or change its conformation. So binders definitely is one approach. In the laboratory, you've probably heard about ozone. Ozone is a potent oxidating gas. And it's, oh, look at this. You can destroy 60-70% of the mycotoxin with this ozone treatment. But what they don't tell you is saying, well, it's got to be 100 ppm, which is very high for ozone, and you've got to treat it over 80 minutes. Oh yeah, you've got to treat it in a big 5 ton silo, which isn't the case. So the trouble with ozone, it is an oxidizing gas which kind of nicks some of the mycotoxin structure to stop it working. But it's how do you apply it on a big scale? And I think what other people forget as well is ozone efficacy is connected to relative humidity. It's all to do with the sort of chemistry. So you've got to increase the moisture to get the ozone, but it's not effective. Other treatments like gas plasma is becoming popular because gas plasma, it must be good. It's got plasma in it. Again, you've got to read the sort of research very carefully because they say, yeah, we can get rid of 80% of a mycotoxin. I've noticed this with mycotoxin research. You always talk about percent decrease. Well, you could start with 1 ppm and go to 0.5, and that's the 50%. So you just got to look into it. Anyway, to the point is with gas plasma again, you've got to treat it for 6 hours and can't char it. So other treatments which are really getting favoured now is what we call the biocontrol treatment, where you can ferment it. So here, for example, you'll get your grain, and what people are looking for are these microbes, and these microbes are other molds. Basically, get a mold to fight a mold. There's definitely probiotic lactic acid bacteria, there's yeast and bacillus. And what these produce is enzymes that, again, change the structure of the mycotoxin. It doesn't totally destroy it, but it stops it working or make it less toxic. So there's very big interest in the sort of bioremediation, as we call it. But not everybody wants to ferment it, because fermentation in its own right can be a problem. You could actually, there's not an interesting story, but I'll tell it anyway, where things like patchouli, for example, when they start fermenting it, these Penicillium expansum can grow and produce actual toxins. So when you're degrading one toxin, you replace it with another. But more practically speaking, I suppose that's what we're going to get to, is that people have looked at things like chlorination, hydrogen peroxide. Again, they say it's effective. It basically oxidizes the structure, but you've got to look at the residues because, as you know, animals aren't fussy. They just don't eat anything. And the other one I've noticed, which my belief is more effective than that, is the caustic action. So things like carbonates, bisulfites, and things like that. Again, they have this action of altering the structure of the mycotoxin. So they're there, but as I say, in research terms, bioremediation is, and our own kind of research, which has been on what we call the hydroxy radical process, which produces hydrogen peroxide ozone with UV, produces these radicals which are very strongly oxidative, much more so than ozone or what you generate from a plasma. And we've done trials with that where we've actually been able to reduce DON, but it's that scale up that's really the challenge on those ones.
Yeah. Well, and for those of us in the feed industry, there's the added expense. Some of these things are, we use binders and find them to be very useful, especially in our sow and our breeding stock. But they're cost prohibitive in large scale. If you're going to market, say 3 million pigs a year, and you want to use binder in all of their feed, it's quite expensive and difficult to pass that expense on in my line of work. So I'm hoping there'll be some work perhaps on treating animals a little differently than humans, perhaps
Yeah, I think,
when it comes to these toxins.
yeah. Sorry, Bob. Yeah, I think that's the case, isn't it? Because I know we haven't talked a bit about what mycotoxins actually do. Basically, mycotoxin, there's various, like there's so many different types of mycotoxins, as you're probably guessing, act differently. But really, what the big serious ones are, like Fusarium orchotoxin and things like that, they basically suppress our immune system. And with our immune system suppressed, they also start disrupting this sort of burst of free radicals that causes cancer damage. And they act as carcinogens, which basically means they can cause abortion or poor development of fetus. So, as you rightly said, the ones that are really affected are people, for the simple reason we live longer than animals do. But it's the young animals versus the finishers, and there should be differences because different tolerances. Because the reality is with mycotoxins, you get this sort of what we call a chronic intaking low concentrations, but then you get the acute, which is if you take it in one big dose, you're going to kind of go. So I agree with you. There should be this sort of range, depending on where that feed is destined to. And the reality is, I wouldn't like to see the time where you would need to use it on all feed. I would, if you've got mycotoxin coming on every batch, then there's something wrong with your supplier. I think that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time here. Is there a topic or something you'd like to mention that I've failed to ask about?
Well, I think mycotoxin. We could spend another hour, I think, talking about mycotoxins. What diagnostics are, and there are cheap diagnostics there. But I think you hit the nail on the head. Is that in a lab you can come up with anything to destroy mycotoxins. They are tough for definite, but the reality is they can be destroyed. But can it be done in a way where it gives tangible benefits? And these tangible benefits obviously improve feed and think, better shelf life of feed or remediation. But I always think rather than remediate is that let's prevent, isn't it? And prevention goes right back to the farm, saying, let's look at what we can do at the farm level when we're producing these corns and grains and nuts, because all very well is that, and this goes for lots of sectors. I could talk to you about the fresh produce sector on this one. You always think at the end, whatever we do beforehand, we can solve at the end. And I think we're all learning lessons now, saying, no, that's not quite the case. What we do at the start dictates what the ending's going to be. So I don't think it should be on the feed mills all. I think, you've got to get this kind of total change, saying, well, how can we prevent mold going? How can we treat plants or grains in the field so we don't have problems later on? And I think that'll be a good thing. But no, it's a very important topic. Like I say, we could speak another hour at least on this, but time is always with us, isn't it?
Yes. Well, and listen, I find this very fascinating, and like I said, I think most of our feed guys will, because this is newer stuff for us. We're really just being brought into this, but I think we'll stop there for today.
It's time for our famous three. Evonik Animal Nutrition is committed to ensure food security and safety while reducing the ecological footprint of animal farming. Its products and services use evidence-based solutions that seek to promote animal welfare and reduce reliance on natural resources. All this is underpinned by long-standing industry partnerships and deep customer understanding. Evonik's focus on efficiency, sustainable, healthy nutrition, and collaborations with livestock farming partners creates value for customers and consumers.
I do have 3 questions that I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, before we end this. And the first one would be, I'm interested in what's your go-to resource, book, person, within the field of mold and mycotoxin. What's a great resource for people to use?
All right. So I'm involved with the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. We develop guides for them. And I think what people miss is that their guides with mycotoxins and molds are very informative. It's basically what everyone bases their kind of guides on. So if you want the primary information, more informative, just go to the FAO website and you can put in mycotoxins and they'll come out with all these documents to do. So I think that's the best resource for the simple reason it's a primary resource, and it's a collection of all the representatives. I was going to say all the scientists in the world, representatives from different nations who's got their own different challenges. So yeah, the FAO mycotoxin guide is definitely.
Okay. And so now, outside of the field of mold and mycotoxin, what's your personal favorite book or favorite resource?
Well, it's interesting, as academics, the only books you read are journals, and it's one of those things where you don't do leisure reading at all. And I must admit, I can't remember the last book I actually read, which probably says a lot about me, doesn't it? But certainly, I like to say, you're always reading something. And what I like reading about, though, is doing things like something new. Like mycotoxins wasn't really on my big radar, but it's interesting when you get opportunities to talk on these podcasts. Is that you look a bit further down to it and see what's going on, and it's interesting how it hasn't really moved forward that much. So to answer your question, I like reading about other things. I do like the history of microbiology and things like that and what happened. So it's all because from history you can see what the future brings. But anyway.
Okay. And the last question is, you know, so there's a lot of people in your industry, a lot of people in my industry. Uh, what's the difference between someone like yourself who is successful in your field and those that are not?
Well, some people would debate if I'm successful because I always find with academia, it's so hard to measure success. In the feed mill industry, you can measure success. You either make a profit or you don't. There's no in between in that.
Mhm.
And, in academia, people say, well, success is getting lots of papers. Well, back in the day, papers used to be a big thing. I would challenge anyone, especially with AI technology now. Does anyone actually bother reading papers anymore? They can just go to an AI and say, "Tell me about mycotoxins," and it'll come out with everything. Is success getting lots of money? Well, people can claim that, but some research is more expensive than others. So when I talk about success, and like I say, it's my view, which probably is not the view of everyone else, is does your research go somewhere? Like all those hours you spent writing grants, all those years that's done on the research, does it produce something that actually produces a product that benefits? And I've been fortunate in doing that. So briefly, we developed this hydroxy radical process, which was based on hydrogen peroxide, ozone, and UV. We showed how it can be used for treating plants in the field, to get rid of moles and other things and strengthen the bolster. We didn't take it forward commercially, but a company called CleanWorks did. And they recently won a $1 million prize for sustainability. And even though I got none of that $1 million, the reality is you've seen that research being translated to practical application. If you ask me what's success and what's not successful, I suppose not successful is leaving the profession of academia, which again, people do. But yeah, to actually measure success, I think still is one of these grey areas. And I think as we were talking about, only at this point in life you look at it and say, yeah, what is success in academia? Anyway, it's what it is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you'll hold on just a minute, I'll speaking to our guest today. I hope you enjoyed the program. If you did, share it with somebody that that you also might think would like it. I'd like to thank Dr. Warriner for being with us. I found it very interesting, sir. So to all of you out there, goodbye and God bless.